Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me for this episode of Women in Sport. I'm really excited to be talking about self-worth and self-awareness. I'll dive deeper into why these are so important to me. But first, I'm just going to go through a little bit of an overview. There we go. So I am going to start with a land acknowledgement. Then I'll do a little introduction about myself and my research. Then I'm going to go through some definitions, really the definitions about all the things that make up self-worth. And then I'll talk about the different things that we need to pay attention to in order to expand our self-awareness. And then we'll end with an opportunity for some questions. So I am currently on the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I'm really grateful to be on this land. It is beautiful land that offers me an opportunity for calm, relaxation, balance. I'm big on the ocean. I've never lived more than 5 minutes from the ocean, and I'm so grateful for that. But in active reconciliation and decolonization and attempts to indigenize my own life and my teaching and my work, I think it's really important to be reading, exploring, and understanding Indigenous ways of knowing, being, doing. My personal research is utilizes a holistic paradigm, which is greatly rooted in Indigenous ways of knowing. And when I think about self-worth, and my own journey into self-worth and authenticity, the first thing that comes to mind is Richard Wagamiese's Embers, and one of his meditations. And I have this meditation on my wall, and whenever things are hard, I always come back to it. And it says, I'm not here in this life to be well balanced or admired. I'm here to be an oddball, eccentric, different, wildly imaginative, creative, daring, curious, inventive, and even a tad strange at times. I'm here to pray and chant and meditate and sing and find creator in a blues riff, a sunrise, a touch, or the laughter of children. I'm here to discover me in all of that. I'm here to add clunky, chunky, and funky bits of me to the swirl and swagger and churn of life and living. It demands I be authentic. So when you look out at the world, that's me dancing in the fields. And when I think of my own life, this always feels like it gives me permission to show up as me. And I always laugh about that line about that's me dancing in the fields. I am far from being a good dancer. But when I think about being in my best self-worth, I think about a bumblebee flying around, curious about everything. That's there. And that's what I think of in that authenticity, that plane of possibility, is this idea of being curious, being open. And when we're strong in our self-worth, I think that's where we can be. So I am grateful to be on these lands. I'm grateful for everything they give me. And I'm grateful to always continue learning about Indigenous ways of knowing and being. So a little bit more about me. I have a master's of education and coaching studies, and this really started my dive into kind of the culture of sport, and issues that are being faced by athletes. And within my master's, I focused on how do we support athletes in the transition out of sport, particularly focused on the identity crisis that can come, and how do we support athletes as they navigate that depression, anxiety, and really the challenges that come. And now I'm working on my doctorate, where I'm focusing on really coaching practices and how do we develop athletes as whole people. This bore out of the research on athlete transition, but also the culture of abuse that exists in sport. Right now, 75% of Canadian national team athletes admit to having experienced at least one form of abuse in sport, with psychological abuse being one of the highest levels. So within my work, I'm looking at how can we better educate coaches, or how can we support coaches to create environments that actually develop athletes as whole people. This is that holistic realm of like spiritual, mental, physical, and emotional. Right now, we do a really good job with the physical, some touch on mental, but a lot of the emotional and the spiritual are missing. And when we're out of balance, we end up striving and trying to obtain things while losing other parts of ourselves. So this is my research. And this is really where the dive into self-worth comes from, because when we look at a lot of the research, there's evidence that athletes feel that they need to sacrifice themselves within sporting environments, and coaches at times tie their self-worth to performance due to the culture surrounding sport. And what happens is in these situations, and is we end up with really need thwarting coaching, controlling coaching. And this is where the abusive coaching comes in. But also, if the athletes don't have strong self-worth and self-agency, then we end up in a situation where they're willing to put up with abusive coaching because they believe they have to. So this is what I'm looking at. And hopefully I can provide some tools and some awareness for leaders as I work through this. So we're going to start in with our definitions. So the whole goal is to figure out what self-worth is. When you Google self-worth, you're going to get a whole lot of answers, and none of them are going to tell you what self-worth is. And so I'm not going to give you the answer yet, but I am going to go through all the different parts about what self-worth is and how it's made up. So one of the first things that comes up when we Google self-worth is self-confidence. And so a couple of definitions of self-confidence here. An individual's expectations of performance and self-evaluations of abilities and prior performance, belief or certainty in one's self and one's ability, and trust of oneself. The big thing that stands out when I read about self-confidence is this self-evaluation of our abilities. And this link to prior performance, because self-confidence is something that's built. We don't automatically have it, but it's something that's built. So self-confidence could be confidence in my ability to publicly speak, or my confidence in my ability to problem solve. For athletes, it could be confidence in certain skills, certain areas of their sport. These are all things where they are self-evaluating, or we're self-evaluating that we either have the skill, we don't have the skill. I can think of myself, like even as a coach, I feel really strong in coaching penalty kill, not so strong in coaching power play. So my self-confidence and my ability to coach penalty kill is strong. However, it's not as strong or not as high when I think about power play. This can be trained though. And so this is the interesting about self-confidence is all the research says that this can be trained through small steps of success or even visualization. So reading about self-leadership and developing our skill sets, one of the things is like often coaching athletes to use visualization, coaching leaders to use visualization and imagining themselves being successful and really paying attention to all the elements that exist. How do they feel in their body? How do they feel in their voice? All of those things, and really utilizing visualization, imagining success, and those can help build self-confidence prior to even going into circumstances where we need to use the skill set. So that's self-confidence. Self-confidence is also linked with the concept of self-efficacy. So self-efficacy is an individual's belief about their capacity to influence the events in their own lives. It's confidence in one's abilities to think, learn, choose, and make appropriate decisions, and a belief that you are capable of performing in a certain manner to attain certain goals. So in the book on self-leadership, it's been an interesting read. It's not the best book, but it's super helpful and really applicable. But I really like the example they give of self-efficacy. It's that imagine you're dropped in a country or a city where you don't speak the language. Are you confident that you can make your way to your hotel? So it's really is like, do you believe you have the skills and the attributes or the abilities to problem solve and get to what you need or want? So self-efficacy is really about believing in our skills. So really connected to self-confidence, but different. Because I think about my life, and I think recently I had a challenge come up, and I remember I was sitting with my counselor and I was talking about, really, this is the part, how can I do everything with distinction, perfection, which is problematic thinking in itself. But she looked at me and she goes, you can do it. And that's the self-efficacy is like, it's going to be hard, but I know I can do it. Where self-confidence is a belief in our true abilities to execute is more of a skill or a knowledge base. But self-efficacy is really that problem solving of like, can I get through it? I may not be at my best, but can I get through it? So for me, I think of self-efficacy when I think of like, I have a busy week of how do I problem solve my way through it? Do I believe I can get through that week? When our self-efficacy is not strong, that's likely when we go into states of distress because our stress level is so high that we're in overwhelm. And Brene Brown actually just released some information yesterday and through her newsletter today on the difference between stress and overwhelm. Really informative and really helpful because I think when we have elevated levels of stress, we can be stressed, but not in a state of distress and overwhelm. And that's really reliant on our thoughts and our beliefs. And when we're stressed, if our efficacy is strong, we still feel okay. And so when we reach that point of just like overload and overwhelm, when everything just feels like it's so hard that we need to take a break. And so our self-efficacy is what keeps us in stress. And sometimes life sends us into overwhelm because we're less resourced, because, we end up with all the problems at the same time. And so this is what self-efficacy is. When our athletes have strong self-efficacy, they believe they can overcome challenges. And that's a big thing. Okay, then we go into self-esteem. And self-esteem is probably the closest we're going to get to self-worth. And a lot of the times when you look up self-esteem, it's going to be directly connected to self-worth. So according to Maslow, so we're talking Maslow's hierarchy of needs, self-esteem is like second from the top, below self-actualization in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And according to Maslow, humans must have their needs of physiological stability, safety, love, and belonging met before they can develop healthy self-esteem. So we need all of these other needs to be met before we can develop self-esteem. And self-esteem is made up of our self-efficacy and our confidence in our ability to cope with life challenges, and our self-respect. So the belief that we are deserving of happiness, love, and success. This is all well and good, but our self-esteem can exist in two different forms. And one of those can be fragile and one of those can be secure. So, and this is also, if we think about it on a spectrum, we can have fragile, high self-esteem. We can have secure, high self-esteem. We can also have low self-esteem. So self-esteem is really the belief in ourselves. And the difference between fragile and high is whether our self-esteem is attached to externals rather than internals. So fragile, high self-esteem is contingent on achieving specific outcomes. And this can be on physical, educational, athletic, can also be attached to others. So I was reading about what's called, I'm blanking on the words, but anyways, like when a coach actually attaches their self-worth or their self-esteem to their athletes' performance, it becomes other invested contingent self-worth or other invested contingent self-esteem. This also happens in parents when they attach their self-worth to the performance of their child in school, sports, all those things. So our contingent means it's attached to something outside of ourselves. And I'll go into where this comes from, because when we get into the self-awareness, the understanding of where we're attaching our self-esteem and our self-worth to something outside of ourselves becomes really important in actually cultivating our high self-esteem or our inherent self-worth. So when we have fragile, high self-esteem, we have an inability or unwillingness to admit to negative thoughts about ourselves. So it's almost this toxic positivity. It's like the belief that I am good, I'm great. I don't even want to entertain that I might be flawed. Fragile, high self-esteem also requires continued validation. So it's the need to look outwards and to receive validation from either accomplishing or from complimenting or really anything that we're perceiving as being good about ourselves, but it's attached outward. Fragile health self-esteem also requires constant self-enhancement and self-protection. So two very different things, but self-enhancement the constant striving to get better. Mark Manson talks a lot about like this trap of like self-development of we get so caught up in the need to just get better that we almost lose track of who we are within that kind of striving. Where self-protection is almost, it's like a buffering against anything that might threaten our self-esteem. So this could look at like always staying within our comfort zone. It could look at avoiding people that might give us criticism or getting really defensive to potential constructive criticism. But really something that's just like we're trying to almost put ourselves in a bubble because our self-esteem is actually quite fragile. On the other hand, secure high self-esteem arises from our psychological needs. So this comes back to Maslow and that satisfying of our needs. When our psychological needs are satisfied without attaining something outside of ourselves, we're going to be in a better place. So this is where our self-compassion, our self-talk all come in because it's related to our belief in our worthiness, which we'll get to. So people with secure high self-esteem, they like, value, and accept themselves, including their imperfection. So there's a very clear understanding of strengths, imperfections, areas of weakness, or desired growth. And all are accepted for what they are. There's not a negative perception about imperfections. It's like, I have them, they're a part of me, we all have them, normal. Secure high self-esteem also arises naturally from meeting life's challenges. So this comes back to that self-efficacy. We can build our self-esteem by really rewarding ourselves for just overcoming life's challenges rather than feeling like we need to constantly maintain our self-esteem. It's like, I overcame the challenge of having a busy day and I'm gonna high five myself for that. And then within this secure high self-esteem, our feelings of self-worth are anchored within ourselves and they're not tied to something outside of us. So that brings us then to what exactly is self-worth. And whenever I go to self-worth, I go straight back to Brene Brown. I think her work is some of the best. And while she doesn't necessarily call it self-worth, she refers to it as worthiness or true belonging. And there's a typo. But so self-worth is a belief that we are worthy of love, connection, and belonging right now as we are. So imperfections and all, we are worthy as we are right now of being loved, of having connection, of feeling a sense of belonging. So in Gifts of Imperfection, Brene Brown says, worthy now, not if, not when. We are worthy of love and belonging now, right this minute, as is. And this is really that belief that I am enough as I am. And so self-worth is truly this inherent belief of being good enough, of being okay with imperfections, recognizing that any imperfections don't make us less than, any failures, any obstacles, they don't make us less than. We're still worthy of love. We're still worthy of connection. We're still worthy of, belonging. What gets in the way of this, though, is when we come back to that contingent self-worth and we believe that our worth is tied to our externals. And this can show up as perfectionism, people-pleasing, using persona. And so Leslie Elm in her book Swagger talks a lot about persona. And that's really, it's like this image that we put on that we think is acceptable. And it's the thing that we think if we show up this way, then we'll be socially acceptable. And this, I think, is something that's really, really common, particularly in women in sport. And I can think of my early self, and I don't know where the idea came from, but basically the perception that I needed to dress a certain way in order to be accepted. And so I had this belief as a woman working in a male-dominated field, where I still do, that I needed to dress a step above because as a woman, that's what was going to get me accepted. In order to earn respect, I needed to look a particular way. And this really attached my worth to my appearance. And this is something that's really common. So we're going to go into kind of more about self-worth. I'm going to go into where those messaging come from, but I'm going to read this again from Brene Brown. It says, when we spend a lifetime trying to distance ourselves from the parts of our lives that don't fit with who we think we're supposed to be, we stand outside of our story and hustle for our worthiness by constantly performing, perfecting, pleasing, and proving. Our sense of worthiness that critically important piece that gives us access to love and belonging lives inside our story. So this is that idea that we tell ourselves stories every day. We tell our stories about how we should act, how we should be, whether we're worthy, whether we have the skills, or we don't have the skills. And this story really impacts how we show up. It impacts how we treat ourselves. It impacts how we treat others. It impacts our ability to be compassionate and empathetic with others, and with ourselves. So this is where we need to get into, how do we actually show up like in our authenticity and in ourselves. And I'm going to tell you, this is probably one of the most vulnerable things that you can do, and probably one of the hardest, because it takes so much of knowing ourselves to truly get to being our authentic self. So authenticity is the daily practice of letting go of who we think we're supposed to be and embracing who we are. This is a big one, because it comes back to that worth of like believing that as we are, we're good enough, and I don't need to act or perform to fit in, to belong, to be loved, to be cared for. We can get into it further, and these other ones come from an article kind of on self-esteem, and it says psychological authenticity can be conceptualized as a dynamic set of processes where one's full inherent nature is discovered and explored, accepted, and imbued with meaning and actualized. There is a need to explore and discover, because so many of us from a young age, we get inundated with stories and messages on what's acceptable, not acceptable, how to look, how to act. And a lot of this happens really in our early years. There's research that says basically in that 0 to 7 is when a lot of this gets imprinted. So if we think about who our influences are, how our parents were at that time, that's going to impact really the internal messages that we tell ourselves, many of which we are not at all aware of. So as we get older, it's like, I think it's once we reach the age around 36, we actually have the capacity to self-assess and learn and start to understand those messages. And the more we can understand those messages and the more we can discover ourselves and get really clear on what our story is, the more authentic we can be, which allows us to really stand in that self-worth, that non-contingent self-worth. So then the article goes on to talk about highly operative authenticity, which is presumed to be reflecting in high self-understanding, objectivity in self-evaluations, and acting in ways that resonate with core aspects and sincerity in close relationships. So when we get to a place of being authentic, we have strong self-understanding. We can be compassionate with ourselves. We can make objective self-evaluations of ourselves. And so I'll get into this objectivity because Ryan Holiday, and really anything with the Stoics, does a really good job of outlining what objectivity is and how do we get there. And then this acting in ways that resonate with our core aspects. This comes back to really getting clear on what our values are, what's important to us, what's our purpose, because life can really pull us away from those things. And I'll talk about, again, the stories and the messages that pull us away from that, and how we get back to really understanding who our core selves are and what our core purpose is and what's important to us. And then sincerity in close relationships. And I think this is important because there's always this concept of like boundary setting almost in relationships. Like I have my inner circle of people, and I'm pretty sure I show up really authentic in those groups. And there's times where other people may not get to see a full authentic self of myself or version of myself. And sometimes that's a form of self-protection, which for me comes from childhood trauma. But it's also just a perception of, have you earned the right to hear my story? And not everybody has the right to hear our story. And in order for someone to understand and hear our story, we need to build trust. We need to build those relationships. And so that sincerity doesn't need to come right away. We don't need to just trauma bond with everybody. Um, Now I need to talk about shame. And you'll notice this is in all black because shame is the dark cloud. So shame is the big thing that gets in the way of self-worth, gets in the way of our authenticity. It's the thing that gets in the way of our self-confidence, self-efficacy, all of those things in the way of our self-compassion, our self-love. So again, from Brene Brown, these come from her Atlas of the Heart, which is a fantastic resource. It's not the easiest read. It's also a giant textbook style book, more of a coffee table book than it is like an easy take with you book, but so full of information and resources. So Brene describes shame as the fear of disconnection. It's the fear that something we've done or failed to do, an ideal that we've not lived up to, or a goal that we've not accomplished makes us unworthy of connection. It's the belief that I'm unlovable and I don't belong. This is the complete opposite of our self-worth. And again, tied to the stories we tell ourselves. Um, Shame is an intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love, belonging, and connection. And shame is a social emotion. So shame happens between people and it heals between people. Renee always talks about how shame can't survive being spoken. So this comes back to those close relationships because those are the places where we can show up and say, hey, this is happening in my head. I am feeling this and I am in my full shame. And I can say, as a leader, as a teacher, there are moments where all of a sudden it's like I get washed over with shame, and you're like, whoa, where did that come from? And it really comes back to, in that moment, I've attached my self-worth to something outside myself. And I can think of those moments as a teacher. And usually for me, it comes to the story I have about respect and the value or the definition I have of respect. And if that gets tested, I go into shame. And it's interesting in that sense because when I stop and I look at it, I go, that's the meaning I'm making of a situation. And I've attached my worth to something outside of myself. But this takes work and this takes time. And I mean, sometimes it happens instantly, and sometimes it takes me weeks to get out of a shame spiral. So, shame, not fun. But if we can find those people and those places where we can talk about shame, then we can start to put shame to bed. Okay. And the opposite of shame is our self-compassion. And self-compassion, again, is a practice. It's something that we continually need to do and meet ourselves with. So self-compassion is often the first step to healing shame. We need to be kind to ourselves before we can share our stories with someone else. So when we are in shame, first step, check in, meet ourselves with self-compassion and understand where that story is coming from and then share. Self-compassion has three elements. So it's self-kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness. So self-kindness is that sense that I can be kind to myself, I can meet myself where I'm at, and I'm not going to judge myself for feeling shame, which is hard, right? Because shame comes with all kinds of dark, scary stories. But being able to meet ourselves with that self-kindness and go, I get it, I understand where I'm at, then we come into our common humanity, and common humanity is that understanding that we are all flawed, and that doesn't make us better, worse, whatever. We are all flawed. It's part of being human. And then mindfulness is that sense of really starting to understand the stories that come up, the emotions, the sensations in our body that come up. So self-compassion entails being warm and understanding towards ourselves when we suffer, fail, or feel inadequate, rather than ignoring our pain or flagellating ourselves with self-criticism. So mindfulness is the recognizing, letting it be. When we start to ruminate or we try and ignore the pain, that's when we get kind of stuck in those emotional storms. When we can actually feel the shame, acknowledge the shame, typically it's about 60 to 90 seconds, and that emotion will process through our body. But when we start to try and shut it down because we don't feel like we can deal with it, or we are critical of ourselves, that's when we get stuck in that shame. And we do some other work to get out of it. Okay. So that all said, in order to really get good at self-worth and authenticity and self-compassion, we need to expand our self-awareness. and this is interesting because I went deep into a lot of books and I thought I would find some really good definitions of self-awareness, and I didn't. So I ended up going to Marty Newman's Emotional Capitalist. Um, and he defines self-awareness as your capacity to understand your emotions and stay in touch with your feelings. It includes self-knowing, the ability to recognize how your feelings and emotions impact your personal opinions, attitudes, and judgments, and straightforwardness, the ability to communicate your feelings, thoughts, and beliefs openly in a straightforward way. And if you look at emotional awareness and self-awareness, there's going to be a lot of overlap in these two. Um, and I think that makes sense because our emotions and our brain are so interconnected. And the more we can get really in tune with our emotions, the better we're going to know ourselves and understand the stories we attach to those emotions or the meaning that we give to those emotions. I also went to Lily Singh's book, Be a Triangle, which anybody with teenagers is a fantastic book, or really anybody. It's a super easy read. It's full of pictures, jokes, and it's really about Lily's attempt to understand herself and navigate kind of those stories that or lessons that we didn't learn in high school, which is the joke around Be a Triangle, because she talked about how much she learned about triangles in high school, but didn't learn about herself. So Lily says the only thing you control in this life is the relationship you have with yourself. Prioritize it, nurture it, and make it the foundation of who you are. That way, no matter what hurdles come your way each day, you can always come home to a relationship with yourself. So Lily talked a lot about in the book about meditation, checking in with herself, disconnecting from her cell phone, and actually just spending time with herself. And I think this is something that really has become more and more challenging as social media and our phones and everything is just so right in front of us. We live in a society of instant gratification, and this being with ourselves and this concept of kind of being bored is become more and more foreign. So self-awareness is really about cultivating that relationship with ourselves, checking in with ourselves, becoming aware of our thoughts, becoming aware of our emotions, the sensations in our body, where are we holding tension? Really, what are we experiencing? And so, and it can be as easy as taking 5 minutes and just checking in. I know for myself, there's a few things that I've done. It's like I have a gratitude journal. I write it every night. And this has been a real process. For me, my gratitude journal originally started with a lot of judgment statements in it. So it would be like, I'm grateful for a good, or I'm grateful for something. And there'd be judgment statements. And it's interesting. Anything we labeled something good, bad, there's judgment in it. So now I've moved towards a gratitude journal and I avoid all judgment statements, which has been interesting to really connect to this moving away from judgment of good, bad, and just being okay with the thing as it is, which again comes back to that self-worth and that self-efficacy of like, I made it through the day and I'm grateful for that. Or I had social connection. Doesn't matter what we talked about, that connection was valuable. And now I can really understand how those things show up in my body, and I can really understand really the thoughts and things that come up with those. I also spend a lot of time doing somatic work. I'm grateful for my counselor because I feel emotions very big. And I spent a lot of time in really a frozen state, emotional frozen state due to previous trauma. So a lot of my work has been really learning to understand where emotions show up, feeling those emotions and meeting those emotions or that tension with compassion. I tend to feel a lot of fear in my spine, and it's really easy to, judge or be angry with that. But the work for me has been moving towards appreciation and understanding the function that is and making it neither good nor bad. It's just there. And I always think of like Brene goes strong back, soft front, open heart. And that is like our back, our spine, that's our strength. And our bodies are so well built to create tension there to provide us with strength. But if we can stay open within our heart, then we can balance those two. And that also comes into polyvagal theory and using both the dorsal and ventral vagal pathways. But so self-awareness, the more we can get to know ourselves, the better. But built into this is all the stories we tell ourselves. And so this is where the objectivity and perspective comes in, sometimes referred to event plus response equals outcome. But we all attach meaning and stories to things. This is, again, that comes back to that idea of judgment. So objectivity and perspective, I'm going to go into, this is where Ryan Holiday comes in, and his obstacle is the way, I think, is really a great introduction to this work, and getting to understand of how we frame the things that come up in our life. So I'm just going to find my notes. So objectivity. Ryan Holiday describes objectivity as the observing eye sees simply what is there. The perceiving eye sees more than what is there. The observing eye sees events, clear of distractions, exaggerations, and misperceptions. The perceiving eye sees insurmountable obstacles or major setbacks, or even just issues. It brings its own issues to the fight. The former is helpful, the latter is not. So objectivity is the ability to look at an event or situation for exactly what it is. Perspective is that meaning we attach to it. An example for yesterday. Yesterday, I was getting inundated with texts about something to do with my hockey team. I instantly went into, this is too hard. Reality is, it wasn't too hard. It was taxing me. It put me in a place of stress because I hadn't anticipated having to deal with it. But my instant perspective was too hard. So what that did was it instantly raised the stress in my body, which then put me in a state of like greater challenge, because when we raise our stress, our prefrontal cortex is not working as well. So things become more challenging. If I can change that story, or I can change how I look at it and go, wait, no, it's just one more thing to do. Good, bad, hard, easy, doesn't matter. There's just one more thing to do. I can bring my stress level back down. Now, two things need to happen there. I need to, one, acknowledge the challenge, because I don't want to deny those emotions. Those emotions are important. They're connected to previous stories. They're connected to previous experiences. But I also need to use my wise mind, my adult mind, to kind of go, you know what, I can deal with this. And this comes back to that self-efficacy. Objectivity and perspective, they're so, so important. And the more we can train or create a space between objective view and perspective view, the better we're going to be. And this doesn't always need to happen instantly. But the more space we can give ourselves to really object, or like take that objective view of things, the better it's going to be. And this is where my work in systems thinking has been really, really beneficial for me, because systems thinking is all about taking a holistic view. And Patrick Hoverstadt refers to kind of the falcon, and how the falcon will spiral up, take a view, come down, and really just use very different levels of abstraction to look at a problem. And it's really this idea of being able to look at a problem from varying points of view and to be able to understand it in context. So I think of when I experience conflict, or what it feels like conflict or disagreement, or when I think that someone is different, or if someone's approach is not right, or when I go into those judgments, if I can pause and I can put myself in their position, or I can distance myself from my own perspective and start to look at someone else's perspective or other potential perspectives, I'm in a better place to be well-resourced and to kind of meet the situation as it is, rather than attaching meaning to it. So this is then where it becomes really important to get really clear on what are our own stories, where do our own stories come from, and can we honor them without kind of dismissing them? Because again, the dismissing is where we kind of get stuck in that emotional state. So this brings me to talking about culture. Our culture, the culture that we live in, the culture that we work in, the culture within our sporting organizations, they all impact how we think and how we approach problems, how we approach obstacles, really how we approach day-to-day life. And oftentimes we're not clear or even aware of those elements of culture. So in systems thinking, they talk about it. Can you see the water that you swim in? And it's really, the water is the culture that exists. And so this work comes from Sheen, and his work on the idea of 3 levels of culture, which is really, again, connects to systems thinking. And in systems thinking, they often use like an iceberg model. And Sheen's culture levels of culture also get set up similar to an iceberg model of like, what can we see versus what's below the water. So the first level of culture is the artifacts, or the things that are visible. So words, behaviors, products. So if we think of a company, what are the words, slogans that they use? What are the products that they produce? Within a sports team, it's going to be the same thing. Like, I always think of the way that athletes do media presentations. Those words and behaviors are usually heavily dictated, or they are media trained on what is appropriate to say. And then the product that they put on the ice, we can see all of that, right? But what we don't know is the meaning below all of that. So that's all. When they talk about artifacts, they're easy to see, but it's hard to interpret the meaning behind them. Below artifacts is espoused values. So, and espoused values are those values that are stated, values and beliefs that are stated. So I think of Simon Sinek's work when he talks about companies and their company values and putting these values on the wall. Companies, organizations, they all have values. I've been in many places where respect is put on the wall, right? That is an espoused value. But what does respect actually look like? That comes down to what's actually happening. Those are the behaviors, like, do those 2 things line up? Brene Brown often talks about like espoused values and lived values. Espoused values are the things that we say that we value, and the lived values are the things that we actually practice. So culture has all these espoused values, or these things that we project that are good, important. If we think about it in our North American culture, there's a big push for individuality, for striving for success, constant improvement, capitalistic. We are well entrenched in our capitalistic values. Below all those espoused values are actually underlying assumptions. So these are unconscious, taken for granted beliefs, perceptions, thoughts, and feelings. So these are really the things that actually make up the story inside our head. So we think about, in Western culture, Western European culture, I'm going to call it colonized culture, because I don't know that I know that we were to go back to indigenous ways of knowing and being, individuality is not one of theirs. They are very community-based. But so if we look at our North American capitalistic culture, like, and this idea of individuality, what is the underlying assumptions or unconscious beliefs that exist there? And this is typically where that contingent self-worth comes from. It's like, I'm only valuable if I achieve X, Y, Z. I work with teenagers on their values all the time, and wealth comes up as a very, very common value. And we dive into, I'm like, well, why is wealth important? Because and the answer that comes out is, when I'm wealthy, then I'll be lovable. And those are the underlying assumptions and the unconscious beliefs. Those are the things that have been inundated in us by the messages from our parents, from our religion, from our culture, from our politics, social media. And these exist in our greater culture. They exist in our workplaces. They exist in our sports teams. I think one thing that exists, and this is where the culture of abuse in sport comes from, is like the underlying assumption that I need to self-sacrifice to be successful in sport. And that I'm going to sacrifice my body, I'm going to play through injury. I'm going to push through. I'm going to give up my other social connection, my other things. I'm going to sacrifice those things because I have to, in order to succeed in sport. And if I don't, then I'm not worthy, or I'm not going to be chosen, or coach is not going to like me. I'm going to lose ice time. And so we have these underlying assumptions in cultures around sport that exist, where athletes are believing they need to sacrifice themselves. They believe it's necessary. And this is embedded in parents as well. And you look at all the research around abuse in sport, we have this culture that parents think coaches need to be loud, they need to be aggressive, they need to be abusive. And it's considered to be holding people accountable. And there's also the culture that, athletic directors, they're turning their back on this because, again, it's the belief that sport is about performance and these things are achieving performance, but we're not looking at what's being sacrificed. So culture plays a very, very big role on our internalized messages and our stories. And the more we can start to dig deeper into what those stories are and how they're shaping how we show up, the better we become at our self-awareness, the better we become at checking. Is that my story? Is that the story I want? Or is that the story I've been told? Which then comes to our beliefs. So this comes from Glennon Doyle. And if you haven't read Glennon Doyle's Untamed, I highly recommend it. So Glennon Doyle says, we are like computers and our beliefs are the software with which we are programmed. Our beliefs are programmed into us without our knowledge by our culture, community, religion, and family. Even though we don't choose these subconscious programs, they run our lives. They control our decisions, our perspectives, feelings, and interactions. So they determine our destiny. What we believe, we become. And this is so true and yet so not talked about. I think particularly with teenagers, I look at how inundated they are with social media and negative messaging and how much they're striving to hit this really, really narrow ideal image of acceptability. I work out at a community gym and I feel sad every day as I watch the young teenagers and you look at the social scripts that they are out playing. The young girls working on their glutes, like they're watching on their phone the exercises from these fitness influencers, and that's all they're working. That's it. There's no, at least from an outside perspective, there's no connection to what are the health benefits, what am I internally getting, what is this doing, what are the good brain chemicals that are going on. It's like it's a full striving to hit a certain body ideal. And it's no different with the young teenage males. I watch them and it is full beach muscles, like buys, tries, chest. That's it. And you can watch them walk around and they're so self-conscious of the way that they look and feel. And it's no different than the adults. I watch the adults and it's very, very similar. My favorite part, though, is watching the older adults that are just there because they're looking for long-time fitness and they don't care what they look like. They don't care about their form. They're just there and they're doing it. But these beliefs get so programmed into us, and our teenagers are getting inundated. And I think it's starting at younger and younger because these kids are getting access to social media so early. And really our culture, it's everywhere in our culture. It's in the TV shows, it's in our religions. Like I went to private Christian school and I can still think about how those messages and a really narrow ideal impact how I show up, and kind of what I deem as good and bad. And well, I've done a lot of work to kind of expand and explore when things get tough, when I reach that level of distress or overwhelm, those are the messages that come up. And it's like my worth is so tied to those external messages. And if I don't take that time to check them, holy, there is darkness attached to that. Because that shame story comes on real strong. So these are those dominant narratives. Brene does a really good job of outlining dominant narratives around like patriarchal views. And I mean, these views exist in so many different ways. Like they're the racialized views that we hear. They're all like, if I'm sure if we go listen to Donald Trump or really any American politician, and I think that the dichotomy that exists in politics right now is like we're hearing two different spectrums of dominant narratives, both of which are really, they're detrimental to who we are as humans and how we feel about ourselves as humans. So dominant narratives are the prevailing stories and perspectives that shape societal understanding and cultural norms, often reflecting the viewpoints of those in power. So this is a key point because the viewpoints that get celebrated or heard or understood are those in power, and often marginalized groups, we don't hear their viewpoints. or their viewpoints get pushed away. So these narratives can marginalize or erase experience and histories of marginalized groups, particularly communities of color, leading to skewed perception of reality. Understanding these narratives is crucial in recognizing how they influence art or all aspects as a means of healing and empowerment, allowing communities to reclaim their stories and societal norms. And this pushback on dominant norms is what we see in Black Lives Matter. This is, the roots of feminism, the roots of really any of our critical ideologies, like these pushbacks on those Indigenous ways of knowing and being, indigenization, decolonization, this idea of post-colonial. We're not post-colonial, but this push to move to post-colonial, but to decolonize how we think and feel. These are all pushbacks on dominant narratives, and really a push towards self-worth, non-contingent self-worth. So this then brings me to boundaries, because when we want to develop and figure out what our stories are, our boundaries are the key to that. So this all comes from Glennon Doyle, and she says, a boundary is the edge of one of our root beliefs about ourselves in the world. So there's so much work and talk about setting boundaries and understanding what our boundaries are. And if you don't know where your boundaries are, go read Glennon. She talks about how anger delivers our boundaries to us. Our boundaries deliver our beliefs to us. Our beliefs determine how we experience the world. And boundary setting is an act of self-compassion. However, when we're not clear of our boundaries, this is when the anger comes up. This is when the stories come up. So I think about myself, and anger is an emotion that I've really struggled with, but I can think of the times when I've easily accessed anger, and when I feel like someone I care about or in my care is under threat. And it's interesting. So it's an instant delivery to me that I believe in support, I believe in care for, and I want to, create an environment that fosters self-worth and inclusion and authenticity. And when that gets challenged, my anger is going to wake up. What is still a struggle is finding that anger for myself and using that anger. Anger is what actually allows us to use agency. And so anger doesn't need to be violent. Anger doesn't need to be unkind, but anger is actually, when used appropriately, is an act of self-compassion, self-worth, and self-agency. And it's a matter of saying, I am worthy, and this is not okay for me. So Glennon goes on to say, anger delivers important information about where one of our boundaries has been crossed. When we answer the door and accept the delivery, we begin to know ourselves better. When we restore the boundary that was violated, we honor ourselves. When we know ourselves and honor ourselves, we live with security, peace, and power. So our boundaries, they are a form of self-protection. They are a form of self-worth, of self-compassion. They are saying, this is what I'm going to put up with. This is what I'm not going to put up with. And when we can start to get really clear on our stories, we get better at setting boundaries. And boundaries are not a demand on someone else's behavior. They are simply a belief and a point of reasoning. So I remember when I was first really learning to set boundaries, and I came back into my counselor and I was like, well, I told an athlete they can't speak to me that way. And she goes, well, that's not a boundary. That's a demand on their behavior. A boundary would be removing yourself from the situation and coming back to circle back and have that conversation when you're both in a better place. So getting good at setting boundaries is not about demanding or trying to control somebody else. It's actually about a control of ourselves and a respect of ourselves, and saying, I'm going to choose to disconnect from this because it doesn't align with my needs, my wants, my desires in this moment. And I'm going to choose my safety. I'm going to choose me right now. We can revisit this, but I need space. So boundaries are really important, and they deliver so much information to us. So when we can actually go, ooh, there's my anger. What's my anger telling us? Now we can start to understand how we see the world, how we feel about ourselves. And really, when we start to look at what we're willing to put up with, it gives us good insight into how we feel about ourselves and how our self-worth shows up in the world. So then this, again, comes back to this idea of emotional awareness. The better we know ourselves and our emotions, the better we become at understanding what our stories are. So awareness of one's own emotions involves attending to and reflecting upon one's automatically generated body sensations or experiences. So emotions are automatic. They are that, I'm going to call it reptilian brain kicking in and showing up and telling us something. Intention and reflection permit extraction of information inherent in an emotional response. It helps a person infer what the interaction meant to them and what they need in that situation. Susan David always talks about that emotions are information and not a demand. Like, our emotions provide us information, but we don't need to act on them, right? We can notice it, appreciate it, and choose how we respond. So that comes back to that objectivity and perspective, or the ability to pause before we respond, right? Our emotions don't need to control us, but they provide us information, and they're important for us to actually pay attention to respond to with compassion and to really understand, because they're connecting to things that likely have happened previously in our lives, and ways in which we learn to respond to perceived threats as children. So then this brings us into emotional agility and plane of possibility. And I realize that's not the right slide there, but that's okay. So emotional agility, and this comes directly from Susan David, is the ability to come to our inner world, your thoughts, emotions, experiences, and self-stories with courage, compassion, and curiosity. Curiosity is key. Instead of these inner experiences holding you hostage, shrinking your life, or clouding your interactions, you are able to learn from them, evaluate the situations you face, be clear-sighted about your options, and move forward with values and purpose. So again, emotions are information, right? When we have emotional agility, we can check in, we can understand what they're telling us, and we move forward in a choiceful way. And this comes to the plane of possibility, which comes from Dan Siegel's work on intraconnected. And when we're in the plane of possibility, we're in this state of, I'm going to call it flow. We can go with what comes up. We're out of a state of rigidity, because when we're in a state of rigidity or attempting to control, it becomes challenging to kind of really experience, to understand, and just move forward from a place of non-judgment. When we can get into the plane of possibility, we can see what's happening. We can rely on our self-worth. We can rely on our confidence, our self-efficacy, and just believe that we can navigate what's coming. When I think about, like, what is my ideal state and my non-triggered, non-trauma response, it's this plane of possibility. It's that my self-worth is so inherent that you can show up and I can show up in this space, and how you are doesn't impact me in any negative way. I can just let you be you. I can be me. And I'm not tying me to anything that you do, any of your words. We exist, and I can be in my greatest state of compassion, curiosity, understanding, and I can better understand you, and I can better understand myself. And so the plane of possibility is really about being so rooted in our inherent self-worth and self-esteem that we can just show up. We don't need to control. We don't need to manipulate. We can just be, can understand, and we let others be in that same space. All right. So what? This is the big thing. Self-worth is one of those things that only gets built or really gets cultivated from a place of modeling, particularly in teenagers. Teenagers, youth, they don't necessarily have the ability to build and cultivate their own self-worth like we do as adults, but they can model, they can learn, they can understand from us. So the better that we can manage, manipulate, not manipulate, that's not the word, but show the ability to navigate our emotions, to move through challenge, to show up in our self-worth, to self-regulate our emotions, then we better equip them. So youth and really teens, they learn from modeling, they learn from cueing, they learn from all the things. So the messages that we show up with, the ways in which we give feedback, The ways in which we take care of and tend to ourselves in their company are going to play a huge role in how their self-worth develops. Carol Dweck's work on growth mindset is all about the feedback that we give. When we praise performance, we're going to develop contingent self-worth. But when we praise effort and the steps that have gone into achieve performance, then we're going to develop an inherent self-worth or a self-capacity and efficacy and confidence in a skill set that's not tied to something external. The other thing is when we as leaders have strong inherent self-worth, then we can detach our self-worth from the performance of ourselves and those around us, which then allows us to create a better need supporting environment. When our self-worth is attached to the externals, to others, we tend to come into a controlling leadership style because we're so worried about how others show up. We're so worried about how others perform because we believe it reflects back on us. So when our self-worth is attached to those externals, we go back into control and we go into rigidity. And it not only impacts us internally, but it impacts those in our control. Because we reduce agency, we reduce self-determination, and those are all things that actually drive motivation. So when we can create need supportive environments that support autonomy and self-determination, we actually build motivation and internal motivation rather than extrinsic motivation, which then further builds self-worth. So the more we can do as leaders to work on ourselves, the better we become at modeling and also creating environments that allow those around us to work on their self-worth. Before I move on, I'm just going to say self-leadership. I'm going to refer to it. It's written from a Eurocentric realm. However, it's a really good starting point. It does a great job of looking at like, how do we actually build our own self-worth or self-confidence? What are the leadership skills we need to develop? Recommend anything really by Ryan Holiday on the Stoics, or just go read Marcus Aurelius if you feel like diving in. Gifts of Imperfection or Dare Greatly, really anything by Brene, but I would start with, this is all about cultivating that self-worth. Glennon Doyle, Untamed, fantastic. Other things like Swagger by Leslie Elm, Neff's Self-Compassion, all of those books. And I have a list of citations that's there of all the things that I've used. A lot of books. And really, I've read these over a long period of time, but they are helpful. So thank you so much. I am going to stop